Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Lulu was no longer the woman who once dimmed her own light to maintain the image of a devoted mother and a dutiful wife. The moment she woke from her coma, it was as if she had been hurled into a different universe, one where nothing felt familiar, and every truth she clung to had unraveled in her absence. Dante, once the anchor of her life, had drifted into murky emotional waters with Brooke Lynn, a woman who now seemed to occupy the space Lulu once called home. Their son, Gio, caught in a storm of revelations about his parentage, spiraled through confusion and anger that Lulu could not shield him from. The revelation that Gio was Dante's biological child with Brooke Lynn had detonated like a grenade, and while the world around her found convenient villains, Lulu became an easy target. Whispers of blame echoed from all corners, some subtle, others harsh and unforgiving, and with each day, she felt the community that once embraced her now slowly turning its back, leaving her to sit alone in the silent debris of shattered loyalties. That solitude was not just physical, it was visceral, gnawing at her soul like an ember buried beneath the ashes of who she used to be. At the very same time, Isaiah was spiraling down a different but equally devastating path. Once a man of purpose and direction, driven by ideals and the unyielding conviction to do what was right, he now found himself cut off from the very mission that had once defined him. His work alongside Jordan had been more than just a collaboration, it had been a bond, a cause, a belief that together they were building something just and unshakable. But with Curtis re-entering Jordan's life and gradually taking over both her attention and her loyalty, Isaiah began to feel like a discarded piece on a chessboard no longer part of the game. The betrayal wasn't explicit, but it was felt in the silence between missed calls, in the growing distance during brief encounters, and most of all, in the quiet withdrawal of trust. Without Jordan and without a purpose, Isaiah was left to wander through the emotional wreckage, craving nothing more than to be seen, to be heard, and to find solace in someone who could understand the depth of his disillusionment. The night they crossed paths at the Brown Dog Bar was not coincidence, it was a cruel orchestration by fate, a meeting of two fractured souls destined to collide. Amid the dim glow of neon lights and the low hum of mournful music, the air between them was thick with something unspoken. Each sip of whiskey dulled their realities but sharpened their awareness of each other. They didn't need words, the pain in their eyes was enough. Lulu's fingers trembled slightly as she wrapped them around her glass, and Isaiah noticed. Isaiah's shoulders sagged just a little lower with each drink, and Lulu saw it. The bar became their confessional, not through speech but through the weight of shared brokenness. And as the night wore on, the barriers between them dissolved, not because of lust, but because of a mutual hunger to feel real, to matter, to be touched not in body alone, but in spirit. By the time the final drink was poured, reason had long since drowned beneath waves of aching need. When their bodies intertwined, it wasn't reckless, it was inevitable. They clung to each other like lifelines, as if their skin could absorb the wounds left by others. It was not romance, not yet, it was desperation dressed as intimacy. And yet, in that fleeting moment, they were no longer the woman abandoned by her family or the man cast aside by his cause. They were simply two people, raw and human, reaching for something, anything, that might resemble healing. The next morning, Lulu awoke to find herself wrapped in Isaiah's arms, sunlight cutting soft slashes through the curtains. For a brief second, she allowed herself to believe in the illusion of peace. But the truth crept back in quickly, curling around her spine like a serpent. She wasn't regretful, not exactly, but she was lost. Her mind replayed the previous night in fragments, stitched together by fleeting emotions and conflicting thoughts. Guilt pressed against her ribcage as she thought of Dante, of Brooke Lynn, of the son she barely recognized anymore. Isaiah, sensing the shift in the air, dressed without speaking. He gave her one long look, an expression balanced precariously between resolution and confusion, then left, leaving behind the heavy silence that hovered like smoke in the aftermath. For days, Lulu walked through Port Charles as though in a trance. She told no one about the night with Isaiah. It was easier that way, easier to pretend that she was still in control. But her body betrayed her. The nausea came first, small, persistent waves that she tried to ignore. Then came the fatigue, the kind that settled deep in her bones. When she finally took the test, her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped it. 2 pink lines stared back at her, undeniable and absolute. A primal fear, dark and suffocating, gripped her chest. This wasn't just an accident. This was a reckoning. She stood in her bathroom for what felt like hours, unsure whether to cry or scream or laugh at the absurd cruelty of the universe. She was carrying Isaiah's child, and the implications of that were staggering. She didn't even know if what they shared could survive the weight of this truth. Would Isaiah want to be part of this? Would he run? Would he claim the child, or reject the idea altogether? And worse, what would Dante say? Would he see this as betrayal or simply confirmation that their time had passed? Even the thought of telling her son made her stomach churn. How do you explain to a child already reeling from one identity crisis that another chapter of chaos was about to be written? Lulu felt the walls closing in. Every breath she took felt like an act of defiance against the panic clawing at her throat. She was no longer just trying to survive her own heartbreak. Now, she had to decide how to protect a life she hadn't planned, in a world that had stopped offering her stability. And yet, beneath the fear, something else flickered, an ember of something quietly defiant. This child, unexpected and inconvenient as it was hers. It was not a mistake. It was a beginning. Whether Isaiah would walk this path with her or not remained to be seen. But Lulu, weary and battle-scarred, began to understand that she no longer needed to beg for a place in someone else's world. She was building her own now, one heartbeat at a time. News of the pregnancy spread through Port Charles like an earthquake no one had felt but everyone somehow sensed, a quiet, seismic shift that rumbled beneath the surface of daily life. Lulu had intended to keep the news private, unsure of what the next step would be, let alone how to face the world with the consequences of one unplanned, emotionally fraught night. But secrets rarely stay buried in Port Charles, and hers was no exception. The discovery happened not with a grand confession or an accidental slip of the tongue, but with a single glance exchanged in a sterile hallway, a glance that carried the weight of betrayal, confusion, and the collapse of trust. Jordan had been at the OB/GYN clinic for reasons related to a WSB case, moving through her responsibilities with the sharp efficiency of someone determined to keep her professional and personal lives separate. That fragile balance shattered the moment she turned a corner and came face to face with Lulu, who stood pale and visibly shaken, holding a folded pamphlet on prenatal nutrition. For a moment, the air between them stilled. Jordan's eyes didn't flare with jealousy. They narrowed with cold calculation and wounded disbelief. It wasn't Isaiah she blamed, not entirely. He had faltered, yes, but in a moment of weakness. No, what truly cut her was the realization that she, the woman who always prided herself on compartmentalizing emotion from duty, had allowed herself to become vulnerable. She had let feelings for Isaiah blur the lines of their operation, and now that vulnerability had come back to humiliate her in the most personal, devastating way. She walked away without a word, her silence far more devastating than any accusation. Lulu stood frozen, unable to follow, unsure whether she'd just ruined one life or several. When Isaiah found out, it was not through a whispered conversation or an angry confrontation, it was through a third party who thought he already knew. The moment the words left their mouth, Isaiah's world cracked. He stood still, blinking as if his brain was trying to catch up with what his ears had just heard. A child. His child. With Lulu. In all his years of navigating crises, betrayals, and moral ambiguities, nothing had prepared him for this. Not because he didn't believe in fatherhood, but because the idea of becoming a father now, amid emotional chaos and professional implosion, felt like an insurmountable twist of fate. He didn't know if what he shared with Lulu had the depth and stability to withstand this. Was it a new beginning or just a desperate escape they both needed in that moment of shared pain? Isaiah didn't react with anger. Instead, he became stiller than ever before, eerily quiet, as though any movement might send his fragile mental scaffolding crashing down. He wandered through the rest of his day like a ghost, not yet ready to speak to Lulu, not even knowing what he would say if he did. Could he be what she needed? Did she want him to be? Or had that night meant something entirely different to her than it did to him? Meanwhile, Dante had been watching Lulu more closely than he admitted to himself. Something in her eyes had changed. There was a guardedness, a hesitancy he hadn't seen in her since the early days of her recovery. He caught it in her pauses mid-sentence, in the way she absently touched her stomach when she thought no one was looking. When the truth finally came to him. Not through Lulu, but through the quiet murmurs that pass between people who pretend they don't gossip, his world didn't explode. It froze. There was no outburst, no confrontation. Just a long, cold silence that settled in his chest like ice. The knowledge that Lulu was carrying Isaiah's child made every effort he'd made to move forward with Brooklyn feel hollow. The late-night talks, the casual intimacy, the shared dreams of starting fresh. It all seemed like a carefully constructed facade that crumbled the second it was tested. Brooklyn, always more intuitive than she let on, felt the shift immediately. She watched Dante pull away, not physically but emotionally, and it gutted her. His eyes no longer held the same clarity when he looked at her. She could see him drifting, see the past tightening its grip around him. And though he said nothing, Brooklyn began to realize she might never be more than a placeholder for a story that had never truly ended. The most unexpected reaction came from Tracy, who, after decades of witnessing the tangled, often toxic threads of her family's legacy, had little energy left for dramatics. When she heard the news, filtered through a web of gossip that was impossible to ignore, she didn't gasp or chastise. She simply sighed, deeply and wearily, the kind of sigh that came from a place of bone-deep exhaustion. The Quartermain house had long been a magnet for scandal, but this one felt different. It didn't just threaten to destabilize a romantic dynamic or disrupt a boardroom alliance, it threatened to rip through generations of unresolved pain, dragging every participant back into the gravitational pull of old wounds and unhealed heartbreaks. Tracy, pragmatic as ever, quietly began making contingency plans, arrangements for housing, for legal counsel, for whatever future this child might bring crashing into their already volatile world. In every corner of Port Charles, the ripple effects of Lulu's pregnancy began to take hold. No one could remain neutral. Loyalties shifted. Secrets piled upon secrets. And amid the chaos, one truth loomed larger than all the rest. This child, unplanned and born of a moment that defied logic, had become the epicenter of a new storm. Whether it would bring healing or destruction was yet to be seen. But for now, everyone braced for impact. Lulu now stood at a crossroads more defining than any she had faced before, a precipice between the woman she had been and the one she might become, with no certainty of safety in any direction. Each path demanded sacrifice, each choice carved from the raw stone of regret, grief, and the flickering hope of redemption. The first path, perhaps the one that tugged hardest at her heart, was to keep the child and face whatever came next with the kind of quiet resolve born from trauma. To let this unborn life be more than just a complication or consequence, but instead a symbol of rebirth, a line drawn in the sand between her fractured past and a future she could claim as her own. Keeping the baby wouldn't just be about motherhood, it would be about agency, about proving to herself and everyone else that she could rise not because of anyone's permission, but despite their judgment. The second path, however, whispered with seduction. To leave Port Charles altogether, to disappear from the headlines, the gossip, the suffocating expectations of those who watched her every move like spectators at a slow-motion car crash, seemed like liberation. There was a part of Lulu that yearned for that blank slate, a chance to start over somewhere her last name meant nothing, where eyes did not follow her like ghosts of a life she could no longer control. But to leave would mean abandoning not just the wreckage of her relationships, but also the possibility of rebuilding them. She would be walking away not only from Dante, Isaiah, and Jordan, but from her son, whose very identity now hung precariously in the balance. Could she truly vanish without that choice becoming its own kind of betrayal? And then there was the third path, the hardest, the messiest, the most courageous, to stay, to face the storm she had helped unleash, and to reclaim her voice in a city that had repeatedly tried to drown it out. This would mean stepping back into the arena, not as a victim or a scapegoat, but as a woman fully conscious of her power and her pain. It would mean confronting Dante, not with anger, but with truth. It would mean facing Jordan, not with apology, but with understanding. And it would mean looking Isaiah in the eye and asking, not what he wanted from her, but whether he was truly ready to walk beside her in the chaos of what they had created together. Staying meant war, but it also meant possibility. It meant standing tall in a city built on secrets and scars, and daring to say, I belong here, too. Isaiah remained close but unobtrusive. His presence was not loud or insistent. It was quiet, steady, a kind of emotional gravity that Lulu couldn't quite escape. He never pushed her for answers, never cornered her with declarations, but his silence carried weight. Every time she looked at him, she saw not just the man from that night, but the man he might become, a father, a partner, or perhaps something undefined but undeniably significant. And it was this gentle proximity, this unspoken willingness to remain even in uncertainty, that made him both a comfort and a burden. Lulu couldn't forget what had passed between them, nor could she decide if it had been fate or folly. Isaiah's very existence in her orbit was a constant reminder that the decisions she made now would echo far beyond her own story. Meanwhile, Jordan poured herself deeper into her role at the WSB, navigating black operations and international threats with renewed focus, as if the complexity of global espionage could somehow erase the sting of personal betrayal. Every mission, every classified file, became a wall she built between herself and the pain she refused to name. She didn't confront Isaiah. She didn't ask questions. She simply moved forward with a quiet ferocity that spoke volumes. To those who knew her, it was clear, she was not running, but she was no longer willing to bleed in silence. And Dante, caught between the ruins of the life he thought he'd repaired and the ghost of the one he had left behind, began to unravel. His days were filled with professional obligations, co-parenting logistics, and trying to hold on to something real with Brooklyn, but at night, when the world went still, he felt the weight of everything he could not fix. He couldn't stop thinking about Lulu, about the baby, about the pieces of his life that no longer fit together. Guilt gnawed at him, not just because he had moved on, but because some part of him still hadn't. The revelation of Lulu's pregnancy made him question everything. His loyalty, his motives, even his capacity to love again without causing more damage. The more he tried to be present with Brooklyn, the more she felt his absence. And though she never accused him of betrayal, the unspoken truth loomed like a shadow between them. She knew he was slipping away, and she feared she was merely watching history repeat itself, this time, with her as the collateral damage. In the background of all this turmoil stood Tracy, a woman who had long stopped being surprised by the emotional implosions of those around her. Yet even she could not ignore the significance of what was unfolding. This wasn't just another scandal or fleeting love affair, it was a generational turning point. A new child, born from contradiction and chaos, with Spencer blood and the mark of a man who had always been on the periphery of power, now stood to become the fulcrum of future reckonings. Tracy, ever the strategist, began to consider what it would mean to protect this child, to preserve what little stability remained in a family constantly at war with itself. She didn't show it, but she worried, deeply. Because this time, the stakes weren't just emotional. They were legacy. The child, still growing silently in Lulu's womb, had already become more than a biological fact. It was now a symbol. A catalyst that had forced open every unresolved wound, every long-buried truth, and every fragile hope. It was a mirror held up to each character, reflecting who they were, what they had lost, and what they still might become. And as Port Charles braced itself for whatever came next, the question lingered like a whisper carried on wind, would this child bring redemption, or only more ruin? Perhaps, in the end, it wouldn't matter what path Lulu chose. Because all of them would hurt, all of them would heal, and all of them would change her. But somewhere in that fragile in-between place, where grief meets strength and love collides with consequence, there existed the chance for something else. Something new. Something luminous. And that, maybe, was enough.